Lila, and Teeps, and Flora, and me. Rocket.
Boost! Fire!
This has happened before.
Advisor.
Console games has been essential to us ever since the late 70s. Arcade cabinets were still at its prime, but to me, I'd much rather play video games at my own leisure instead of being pressured by improving on a game while also wasting your hard-earned cash. Not to mention overstimulation which arcades tend to give with their inevitable irritating noise, bells, whistles, and lights. I was born in the late 80s, so what better console to start out with than the most iconic breakthrough that brought us out of the darkness from the nefarious video game crash, the original Nintendo Entertainment System. Ever since Mario renaissanced the video game industry, it's not so hard to see how and why it's so legendary. Despite the annoying factor blowing on cartridges to make them work while also rusting its teeth. Nevertheless, there is a plethora of games to choose from, so I'll be acceding to 20 entries for a change. From at my own home to my parents' second mom-and-pop shop, the NES shall be the first to tackle for 2025. Before I start this countdown series, I want to lay down some ground rules. The following consoles won't be included in this series. 1. No Atari, Intellivision, or Odyssey. I wasn't really into the first generation, and every arcade classic is a given and never intrigued me. Excepting my first ever game, Frog Bog, so too with the turbo graphics as I only knew a few games. 2. No Xbox games. I was only into two things. When ToeJam and Earl transitioned there, even though the third game was boring. Only Blinks the Cat was exceptional, and I only associate Microsoft with computers. 3. Chances are you won't see much of the 7th and 8th generations. That was when games began to get mundane and prone to wokeness. Also, portable consoles such as the Game Boy Advance and DS will be considered. Keep in mind, these are my favorite, not the best. I'm tired of all those annoying tier lists. And finally, picking a favorite game is just literally impossible, and it's always subjective to change. Making these top lists would make it all worthwhile. So grab your zappers, gamepads, and Nintendo Power catalogs, and let's delve into its pioneering dominance of Nintendo. Starting this video game journey is the underrated classic for the Zapper, Gotcha the Sport. When people refer to shooters, they always refer to Duck Hunt and never bring this up. I find that sad, to be honest. Gotcha has a few more engaging and detailed environments, contrary to the basic open field featuring the ducks and dog, or the flat plain with the white saucers. From the woods, as I mostly recall, to the warehouse district, to a snowfield and back, and actually taking place in side-scrolling as you take out waves of snipers and capture the flag. The music, albeit repetitive, still gives it a charm, even the title itself. Better than Duck Hunt's limited repertoire, and you tend to pick up ammo besides. It does test your wit with a tad more, even giving you a time limit as you progress, then return to the starting posts in each level. There are more rounds to go through, and even 3 skill levels to choose from. It's too bad this 8-bit shooter is never brought up, even not in Smash Bros., and becomes obscure with Duck Hunt suffocating everything. And it's low since it's still basic, and there's always the chance the zapper always tends to malfunction after a short while. Negative points since it was actually developed by the notorious LJN, but it did actually sell merchandise by Entertech, such as paintball guns, targets, suits, protective glasses, and even the Commando and the double pistol set emblazoned with the Gotcha logo. Duck Hunt never went the extra mile here. This Nintendo shooter is criminally undervalued, and always surpassed by Duck Hunt. Because it's one of LJN's rare decent titles next to Spider-Man and Venom, I wish more consumers shall appreciate and recall this in the near future. Let me just set up this scenario. I wasn't really an athlete, nor have high stamina, good coordination, nor a good gait for balance. So I was never into any real-life sports aside from bowling, as they are prone to either injury to yourself or others, or too destructive to be emulated either indoors or outside. So playing a sports game was a lot more safer and attracting. The NES library had tons of choices, but I think the earliest encounter I had was ice hockey. Aside from those such as Double Dribble and another later contender, this was the one that stood out to me like an icicle. Besides, how appropriate since it's during the winter, eh? Anyway, ice hockey's a game I'd recommend for an early basic sports game, as it's simple to set up your and an opposing team. The arena is pre-made, and the physics aren't too difficult to handle. It is designed to simulate ice hockey in real life, but unlike reality, a team's set up with 5 players rather than 6 counting the goalie, and they're classified into 3 types. Those being the nimble though weak runners, who are mostly good at face-off, the moderate balanced players, and the slow though strong players who are bad against the face-off, but designed for long powerful shots into the opposing net. Heck, it even simulates the occasional puck fights between opponents, and being penalized, even marking locations on where the player can go. There were also some notable differences between the Japanese and US localizations. Regardless, ice hockey isn't owned nor made by the corrupt EA Games, and is one of Nintendo's independent sports titles, which don't rely on excruciating constant annual releases, nor be so complex like modern titles, and just stay as basic as the title itself. And I'd love to keep it that way. This is how I play. The home of my first ever electrokinetic is here. 1943 was a so-so choice for an NES entry, but is kind of unorthodox. I actually found this game on an NES emulator by pure chance, and it was back in 2002-2003-ish, which was the same year when I was a freshman in high school. It was probably out of curiosity from world history during that time, and might be close to describing World War II. I'm not sure. But what I do know is that I was turned on by its uniqueness made by Capcom, as the Super Ace is the star and the hero aircraft shooting down many Imperial fleets, with its basic warheads and of course summoning lightning. Unfortunately, as amazing as it sounds, the fighter jet still has its limitations on having paper cup endurance, much like in Gradius, and the game itself can actually be mundane after a while. Also, I didn't get very far, and military games isn't really my niche, although the game spawned some sequels shortly after. Actually, it was known as the first ever Capcom series to spawn several sequels, up to 5 of them, before Mega Man came to be. Perhaps it was from the Ace's electrokinesis that made it and the game itself stand out from the crowd. This was just one of the 8-bit classics I'd long forgotten about, perhaps around the time I was playing in my parents' second shop. Kiwi Kraze, aka the New Zealand story, was just very obscure. It was made by Taito, after all. You play as a Kiwi bird named Tiki who rescues his own kind scattered around the country by a lardy walrus and its minions. I mostly recalled a bird shooting arrows onto a crystallized sperm whale, even shooting the inside of one, as well as the gulls turning into a cuckoo clock of sorts, thus helping me identify this trippy title. Tiki doesn't necessarily fly, but he can ride blimps, UFOs, and balloons, mostly laid out by enemies. And aside from endless arching, he can also pick up bombs and bouncy fireballs. Just like with Sonic 3 and Knuckles, the levels are very expansive, allowing Tiki to explore many paths. However, this can also be detrimental as you usually have a strict time limit. Even worse is that it's relatively unseen. When the alarm occurs, it can be so agonizing by pressuring the player to hurry up, then become sinister as a demon begins to chase you down, prompting the Kiwi to rush and collide into an enemy or hazard carelessly and dies in one hit, or simply by drowning. No wonder Logan always hates arbitrary time limits. And I think this was just the earliest example on making me despise them. It was always nerve-wracking under these tense circumstances. Maybe it was one of those cases when the Taito team drank too much vodka, which is highly probable, but it's no wonder my mind rejected it long ago. I won't necessarily consider it to casual nor new gamers, but it was an interesting find. Nevertheless, if you have tons of dedication and the patience of a saint, perhaps they shall consider this title home. Racing to 16 is the intense motorbike battle game Mach Rider. I'm sure that a lot of you recognize its signature tunes from Smash Bros. Melee as the alternate song for the Big Blue stage. Indeed, this is the mind-blowing how classic it belongs to. You control the Mach Rider through a futuristic Earth set in 2112 and deal with the invasions of the alien race known as the Quad Runners, and have a hell of a time destroying them or defeating them in races. It's said this game's a bit complex, as you shift gears with the vertical buttons, steer left or right, accelerate with A, and fire with B instead of braking. Plus, you have a variety of modes at your disposal, such as designing your own course, Battle, which is the main plot in the game, Endurance Course, which is basically time trial, and Solo Course, which functions the same, only with no enemies. There are still some hazards to avoid, people to rescue, and quad runners to destroy. But when they decimate you, your body scatters and reassembles itself as long as you have energy left over. Still, I always can't understand that whenever you lose, it always says the end instead of the usual game over. It might have been a translation error, but it's always struck me as very weird. Also, thanks to Melee, the main themes are just highly addictive, even more than the game itself. I think this game was inspired by those fast-paced stormtrooper battles within the forest moon of Endor, during that bike battle through its woods while getting to the Death Star's shield, and before Luke and Leia encountered the Ewoks. Interestingly to note, this game was a concept back in 1972, in which Nintendo itself orchestrated a plastic car toy, or a hot rod named the Mach Rider, consisting of a ramp for jumping, and a stick shift to increase gears, and the cars placed inside to be charged, then released at high speed. Man, Nintendo was just so innovational starting in the 70s. And while it still is, it just doesn't feel as riveting as it used to be, and as the game is. When people think of a Rareware racing game, they usually automatically pick Diddy Kong Racing, me included. But quick question. Did you know that Rare has developed another well-renowned racer? Case in point, RC Pro-Am. Just like the usual brand of the classic remote-controlled race car toys, the British company has decided to take it up a notch and transform this brand into an absolute legend. I'd say it's more interesting than the mediocre, frustrating Rad Racer. I remembered my dad playing this many times in my parents' first mom-and-pop shop, often on a small screen behind their main red and blue counter. And he'd usually win trophy after trophy, with the occasional shtick here and there when he's disqualified. But he'd often gain a lot of those goodies, and I eventually tried it for myself. And boy did I suck at it. Always cruising, but more like following the walls than sticking to the inside tracks. And oh man, I love all those trophies, especially the big guns. As one of Rare's most successful first games, it's no wonder it's considered as one of the all-time best games in the entire NES library. And it was also included in many top games of all time lists. It's too bad I never see it on YouTube lists though, like several other titles, aside from monotonous Watch Mojo. With its outstanding quality in terms of graphics, sound, and gameplay, it actually inspired other racing titles, such as Rock and Roll Racing, and even the Mario Kart series. Aside from the aforementioned Diddy Kong, if only they would have continued with the Animal Buddies.
We got this, man! We got this by the ass!
On the subject on racing games, why didn't Logan mention this? It's hard to believe he has forgotten Shigeru Miyamoto's own motocross game, especially since this was one of the launch titles for the NES, even predating the Super Mario Bros. This was incredibly fun to play. I always liked playing this when I was a wee lass, even though I was no professional racer. The main motorcyclist can collide into other opponents simply by bumping atop or in front of them, but you can't crash from behind, otherwise you'd spin out. It doesn't really have any weapons, it's just pure strategy on navigation and balance, and trying not to overheat your cycle if needing a boost. Damn, is that high pitch so annoying! You also gotta deal with numerous ramps along the way, aside from dirt patches and grass, hindering you. The arrows can actually increase your boost, although you must finish in 3rd or higher to progress to the championship. And there was also a fun design mode in which you can customize your own obstacles on a free track. Aside from the different vibrants, this was just a lot of fun. I always loved to use the tall mountains, not only to confuse the miscellaneous racers, but sometimes it just cracks me up as I see my racer keep tumbling down the slope. Excitebike is an NES game I'd highly commend, even over its sequels. Shigeru did one hell of a job, and I can't recommend it enough as your first racing game that surpasses Gyromite. It's surely an exciting biking experience. One of the best games released during my birth year was Skate or Die. What's even more interesting is that it's been developed by EA, before it became one of the corruptive scums of the earth. Actually, its past founder, Trip Hawkins, hired several programmers to emulate the intensity of the Epic's games. And goddamn, they broke the streets and cleaned the oil. A lot of gamers would rather play the modern Tony Hawk titles, but to me, this was my GOAT when I was little. I wasn't much of a professional skateboarder, but every single one of the circuits were very creative. The game features 5 events, including the Joust, 2 half-pipes, including the high jump and freestyle, and 2 downhills such as the race in the park and jam within the streets. I always had my faves being Jam and the Joust, too. I don't know if this is true or not, but the purple mohawk guy at the skate shop could be the inspirational design for Stu Pickles and Rugrats. Sometimes I wished it was him, actually, hanging out and maintaining skateboards, rather than inventing toys without a steady income. At first it was a tad creepy with him staring at you, though. Just like with Excitebike, I don't know why, but the falls during the Joust cracks me up a lot. Nonetheless, just like ice hockey and Excitebike, I'd highly recommend it to any casual like me that wants to experience hardcore sports without the harshness of reality. Hoo boy, the 3D Battles of World Runner. It's been a rough few years since I'd mentioned the classic on my countdowns. Just like the next contender, this solely requires on shooting enemies and jumping over expansive obstacles and hazards. Aside from pitying and praising the numerous serpent bosses in the past, this was definitely a breakthrough in the Mode 7 capabilities before the SNES's inception. Squaresoft was motivating when they made this classic, and it was a welcoming break from the usual Final Fantasy, and like Rad Racer, the music itself was composed by the legendary man himself, Nobuo Uematsu. Heck, I was born when the game came out, and I discovered this when I was a toddler, so it was important to me personally. Despite the infuriating obstacles, i.e. the handmen, and the constant longer abysses, as well as the strict time limit when taking out numerous fast-paced snakes, this was just one of the pioneers on 3D gaming, albeit basic. And the levels and snakes themselves tend to keep you on your toes with hardly any reprieve. It's an absolute injustice this has never been brought up in any mainstream countdown when it comes to NES games. So too, it not only paved the way for 3D shooters, but Square's team created this before they nearly went bankrupt during the first Final Fantasy installment. Jack's adventure certainly needs to be mentioned more here, and the obsessive opaque cloud of Final Fantasy must be dissipated to appreciate other gems. And aside from the annoying enemies and hazards, it's certainly a Square gem never to be reckoned with, nor be underestimated. A lot of nostalgic consumers would always turn to Spy Hunter for an overhead car shooting title, but the run for my money always goes to Data East's Bump and Jump. Spy Hunter may have introduced car shooting and bumping into enemies, but this stood out like the jumping car itself. Throughout each level, you gain points by crashing enemy vehicles by bumping them off the road, or simply by hopping onto them like Mario. You avoid obstacles, take the inside track, and not crash into walls nor large hazards, which the screen gives the exclamation signal to jump over great distances. You collect fuel tanks to make your speed and jumping constant until reaching the goal. The riveting action, the unique fun ability to make your car jump, the dazzling environments and engaging challenges just make Bump and Jump stand out above the crowd like the soaring vehicle itself, and can also make a great and more attractive successor to the obsolete Spy Hunter, or the predecessor of vehicular combat before there was F-Zero X. It may have left its mark as a pioneer and its catchy theme, but Bump and Jump literally takes car shooters to new heights. We can't possibly gloss over the cutesy Capcom platformer Little Nemo. It made me wish I would have included him in my petites list. Aside from 1942, this was another Capcom game that stood out to me, although I did come across it when I was a youngster. I never actually followed the manga series of Little Nemo nor saw the movie at the time, so this was definitely a first. Besides, having adventures in your own subconscious mind is certainly an interesting experience, even making its mark more than with Mega Man and DuckTales, especially since its mechanics be used 3 years later in Kirby's debut game. The most interesting factors were traversing through your own dream world in vast environments, no requirement for an air meter, riding several creatures and turning into them simply by feeding them endless candy, or using a wand later on. Although it can get a little rough in terms of difficulty or finding all the keys needed to access the next level. Nemo's reluctant mission was to rescue Morpheus, the Dream King, from the ruler of Nightmare Land to restore peace and light to Slumberland, and also having his daughter as a playmate in his dreams. I'm quite jealous. This was just a better example on being a Dream Master before there was Luigi being as such, and definitely a positive one compared to that scary mutant in VR Troopers. I wish the dream monsters you ride on was mentioned in Quarter Guy's Methods of Transportation list, as there was nothing else like it. As you become these adorable creatures after feeding them candy, Little Nemo actually shows more value than the arrogant Captain N, as he juggles real life and fantasy responsibilities with school and all. Deke should have taken notes from this more serious little tyke, and it's a lot more tolerable than Bart's flunked-up nightmare. I definitely recommend this simple platformer to anyone willing to the NES era. If there's any point-and-click adventure I'd highly commend, it's the NES port of the Kemco classic Shadowgate. Wielding the same style as its predecessor Deja Vu, you're tasked as a nameless player when you stand before the mysterious castle Shadowgate and recall King Lakmir beginning your quest to defeat the Warlock Lord and prevent him from raising the behemoth. As the name implies, you're in for a perilous journey, as you venture through many tricky puzzles, avoid numerous deathly traps, and strategize against several beasts along the way. You also collect plethoras of items in which you can use in a variety of commands. Navigation and inputting such a series of functions can be consistently frustrating, and the gameplay can be very vindictive for novices. Believe me, you get tired really quickly when you see the Grim Reaper upon every trial and error. Accompanied by a time limit, as you must have lit torches in your possession at all times to prevent yourself from stumbling into your demise. Due to its tumultuous difficulty, it was just enough for the top 10. And I've discovered this as my older sis was playing it a long time ago on the NES. She was into many RPGs. I even made a crossover featuring the city of Final Fantasy as a love letter and the first farewell to the Juggernaut. It is indeed a creepy experience, perfect for Halloween aside from Castlevania or Ghosts and Goblins. And this shall always be the horror classic I always turn to. I still wished it was more recognizable, but if you have the wits and skill that can rival other RPGs, Shadowgate is certainly the chilling standard. This title is an absolute classic, and I'd highly recommend it to any NES consumer. I'd say it's not only one of the rarest and expensive NES games out there, but also one of the most underappreciated. No one has ever mentioned this late platformer on any countdown, and it deserves more praise. Ever since I first discovered this back in 2002 via emulator, same deal with 1943, it has been a favorite almost instantly. I have mentioned this on several lists now, and I definitely prefer this over the usual titles such as Bobble Bobble, or the nefarious Legend of Kage. This game tests your platforming and strategy even for such a game that was released during the SNES's infancy. You play as 4 heroes consisting of a petite named Little, aka Little Samson, who's balanced and throws bells. My favorite, the female dragon Kikira, that hovers and breathes fire. My second favorite, the adorable strong golem Gam, using basic geokinesis. And the quick though puny mouse KO, who leaves bomb traps. And you deal with the Demon King Takid and his deadly minions along the way after he invades the kingdom of Forgi, run by Hans XIV, who recruits this quartet. If you can find access to it via emulation, or a physical or digital copy, and need a classic challenge, Little Samson is Taito's greatest retro creation. One of my personal choices for my underappreciated games is here. Crystalis was definitely the golden forgotten standard of all NES RPGs. Like I said about Final Fantasy or with Dragon Warrior, I wish it never overshadowed this SNK installment. Ever since I was around my toddler age, it was almost like love at first sight. You play as an amnesiac robot which was activated after a dystopian apocalypse. You first arrive at the town of Leek and learn on your quest and the world ruined by mutated creatures as the majority of the population evacuated to a tower in the sky. It seems more engaging than with Final Fantasy and Zelda as you collect items, wield various weapons, level up, meet a few sages and give you new magic techniques, solve many puzzles, and explore tricky dungeons with an archfiend assigned to a separate element. Yet still, it does go by the technology versus nature approach. I think this game might have been inspired by the OG Final Fantasy, more than Dragon Warrior, by rearranging elements from it like a draconian with its cronies or collecting 4 elemental swords instead of crystals. I'd mentioned this gem in several of my own lists, and even made some slight references in my Final Fantasy one-shot, The Revelations of a Warrior. Erroneously, I'd stated in my underappreciated lineup that Crystalis had a port for the GBA, which in fact is for the Game Boy Color. I won't recommend it despite its advancements in translation, including giving the protagonist an official name, Simea. Since the resolution is poor, which allows projectiles to be unseen, and the music never sounds good in the Game Boy sound font. And unfortunately, this was the only SNK title I ever got attracted to, which is why I'd always prefer the original over anything else, thus taking the 7th spot. It was released very late, yet still, it was worth the wait. Another rare classic making the list is Snake, Rattle, and Roll. As the name implies, this is a snake platformer that was heavily inspired by Elvis's Shake, Rattle, and Roll, along with other hits from the 50s rock era. Either Rattle or Roll, or even simultaneously, must navigate through pseudo-3D mazes in order to eat their delicacy, known as the Nibbly-Pibblies, which actually make the snakes wield longer tongues and bodies, while also gaining weight for meeting the requirements on the scale at the end of each level, thereby opening a door to the adjacent level provided. They too can also eat and attack many enemies, which help elongate, but not as quickly as their matching delicacy. Like Mario, they can jump onto enemies, though they must maneuver carefully once their bodies are too long. There too is a time limit for each level, along with many hostile obstacles to avoid such as sharks, spikes, and crushers. Unlike Kiwi Kraze though, the time limits seem more lenient, as are the lives and continues. Many power-ups are designed for various functions such as time extension, invisibility diamonds, speed-ups, extra lives, continues, or even reversing their direction. This can be played either solely or by co-op, but rest assured, it's not quite as volatile as Rare's Battletoads. Also, since it's based on 50s classic rock, this game was composed by an arcane artist that can rival Nobuo, the Rare Man himself, David Wise, before he'd architect tunes for the Donkey Kong Country series. I swear, if I should make a top composers list, he can be in first place. With all those unique factors, I hope Snake, Rattle, and Roll would get more recognition, praise, and perhaps a remake instead of just inevitably slithering into obscurity. When gamers think of a Konami Space Gun title, they always would rather pick Gradius. I wasn't into the series, to be honest, on account it was kind of bland, and the fact that its ship is always destroyed instantaneously. It was consistently frustrating, even when I encountered the original, or even Gradius 3. So what other Konami title had I chosen? This was just another mystery solved, and before Star Fox existed. This was my go-to space game, along with another contender incoming, functioning nearly the same as Galaga in a side-shooting style. It almost simulates three-dimensional astral combat. It was always a fun title, visiting the entire solar system en route to the sun, where the intergalactic enemy is located. From 2 warps to Neptune, there are asteroids to avoid and numerous ships, satellites, and several unique bosses to decimate. Let me tell ya, the designs of those boss fights are freaking insane! The NES version has a lot of different factors from the original arcade, such as having 38 levels instead of 24, including Venus, Mercury, and finally the Sun after Earth. It actually has an ending saying the universe was in perpetual peace. Before there was Star Fox 64, this game also had some charge shots, but are actually limited to the amount of energy radiating from your ship. Bonus stages are also included, providing chances for needed items. Even the aforementioned bosses are included, contrary to the arcade. And lest we forget the addictive soundtrack, especially the remake of Toccata and Fugue in D minor, BWV 565, and the bonus stages. Heck, there's even another version of Stage 1 unlocked as an Easter egg in one of the Dance Dance Revolution games. That is dedication, but it's just heartbreaking that it never ever got a sequel, unlike Gradius. I can't be sure why I'm not part of the status quo. No one ever mentions this epic space shooter. If only Konami would stop being corporate and perhaps make a 3-dimensional remake of this underappreciated adventure. How can we possibly forget Yoshi's amazing NES puzzle game? This was just one of the most addictive and fun titles in the 8-bit library. And believe it or not, I discovered the Game Boy version before this. It was also by emulator, and it's not Yoshi's debut. Just like Little Samson, this game was released late, and during the SNES's early years. I would much rather prefer this over the overrated simulating Tetris any day, along with another contender. And to have Mario, the adorable Yoshi, and his food to eat was just irresistible. You simply rid of booze, piranha plants, Goombas, bloopers, and sometimes other items like fruits and power-ups in the trickier setups. By matching an obstacle on the playing field at the topmost layer, it disappears, and the field must be cleared completely before the row should reach the top. Mario switches the floorboards around, and sometimes you can collect a Yoshi by hatching an egg by attaching two halves. Even a bigger one if it combines with enemies above a shell. There were many reasons as to why Yoshi is a relatable character to me, and he was just a stunning character to use, especially in his first ever puzzle game. It's user-friendly and casual, has catchy music and great gameplay, decent challenges, produced many different ports, and kick-started Yoshi's own franchise aside from Mario World. Thus, the perfect choice to take the 4th spot in this large roster. Dr. Mario was just the golden ticket when it came down to my favorite puzzle NES game. And this has always been the polar opposite to the complicated Tetris. Not just on the NES, but throughout its many ports including the Game Boy and Super Nintendo. Japan was a genius making this phenomenal puzzle game, starring the plumber and the cute viruses, Fever, Chill, and Weird he must defeat. Better than the hypnotic Russian counterpart, that's the truth. Just like with Yoshi, it's a falling block puzzle game in which you turn yellow, blue, and red pills inside the bottle and eliminate each virus with the corresponding color. And it too has an addictive soundtrack, albeit repetitive, and Mario and the viruses were just so luring. It tends to give you that vibe on treating an actual patient, rather than that horrendous complex trauma center crap. This game requires strategy while placing the pills, even if pieces should rain down on your screen, after someone makes multiple matches, but also very fun to play. It was so impactful to me ever since I was very little. I used to see my late mom play this almost every night, as she was a huge fan of both Dr. Mario and Tetris. She was a pro at both games, whether it be on the NES or its other two ports. I even recall the days when she used to play with me competitively in versus mode, and I was just glued to the TV as she played too. Those were the finest days we ever had, even after a tense day at school or between the family. It was so successful that it made many ports, even as a minigame in various titles such as Brain Age 2, WarioWare, and even had a sequel with Dr. Luigi in honor of the Green Plumber in 2013. And even an expansion in Dr. Mario World featuring more viruses to destroy. Dr. Mario's definitely the champ over Tetris, and takes the bronze medal. Yet there are still two others that are just as nostalgic and favorable. It's no doubt that this is the most underappreciated Mario game ever, and my most underrated. Super Mario Bros. 2's definitely an imported treasure despite being a consumer's trash. The story goes that Japan soon released a sequel, a difficult duplicate of the OG Mario Bros. However, Nintendo of America rejected it, and for good reason, with its striking similarities and unrelenting difficulty. So, in order to make a successor accessible internationally, this was just the way to be. Aside from other approved absurd sequels such as Zelda 2 or Simon's Quest, its original concept in Japan was Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic. With some Mario elements thrown in, Miyamoto was just giving us a nice gift. It was just my all-time favorite Mario platformer, even more than 1 and 3. Unlike them, however, this doesn't take place in the Mushroom Kingdom, nor has Bowser, but rather in the Dreamworld Subcon run by Wart. I like its differences, especially when you actually get to pick your own platformer, each with different abilities, and actually making Luigi, Toad, and Peach useful for once. There are many useful items such as POW boxes, cherries, seeds, sometimes the deadly bombs, hearts, and the interesting magical doors. The level design's solid, the soundtrack's memorable, the boss fights are challenging and engaging, and it had a very intriguing concept that no other Mario game has replicated, until Dream Team. The funny thing is, I don't know why, but when I was 3, I used to call these things the shadow doors, while they were just entryways, whether they're black or white with rays shining in. Don't ask. Despite its critical success, it's always treated as the black sheep by many gamers. It's just plain sickening. Aside from my mutuals, I hardly heard nothing positive. And even to this day, I still find it as the ugly duckling of the Mario series and NES games as a whole. I definitely consider it to any gamer no matter what the skill levels. And this shall always be the sequel I defend and die on that hill doing so. And that is for reals. Phew! We finally plowed through my longest tumultuous list ever. But before we get to the most dominant NES game, let's have the honorable and dishonorable mentions play. When I was thinking about tackling my console games for 2025, and when I wanted to summarize my NES games, there was only one grand champion. Out of all of this, as vaguely as I remember it, this has always been my chosen, even surpassing those predictable leaders such as Mario Bros. 3, Tetris, and Mega Man 2. They just weren't good for me to play in one sitting, has no save features, they get mundane or difficult, and while they were classic, they never held lightning in a bottle. There was only one that shines as much as serious, and that is the Guardian Legend. Just like with Super Mario Bros. 2, I find this to be the most rarest, underestimated NES game that ever existed. It's stunning from sight, to sound, to gameplay, and everything in between. This might as well be the first game that sold me on a personal level. You play as the lone wolf named simply as the Guardian, and your mission is to destroy an alien-infested world, Naju, before it should invade Earth. In order to do so, you must find and activate the 10 safety devices located throughout labyrinths and chambers to activate its self-destruct sequence and save the universe. Now, some might say it's a rip-off of other games like Zelda, Metroid, or even Blaster Master or Life Force. Who cares? With a few diverse gameplay styles held up in one damn cartridge, it's definitely an absolution. In fact, I invite them to play it for themselves, because I feel there's something in it for everyone. While most NES games hold back quality due to technical limitations, it hardly is ever affected. I'm serious, its music's alluring, sounds attracting, graphics are flawless and exquisite. Its two different methods of gameplay can always have you compelled for more. Even its difficulty seems to be in the gray area, contrary to people saying it's either too easy or spikingly hard. For 1990, this is probably the best game in presentation on the NES. The only flaw can be its repetition, but that never seemed to drag on. The long passwords, though, can be a chore to write down. And the best part is, the Guardian is actually a female protagonist! You see, blind consumers, Samus ain't the only Nintendo female protagonist. And the worst thing is, it has been lost in obscurity since it never had re-release on Wii's Virtual Console, nor Switch Online.
Why not?
I remember vaguely that my older sis's former close friend from Clifton had a brother who was a pro in Nintendo games, including this one and Super Mario World. I was around 4 or 5-ish, and naturally I was always a novice, but the game caught my eye and ears. It has been a rare mysterious treasure found after decades of obscurity, and being how impactful, unique, and thrilling it truly is, no one has ever brought this up on any list at all! Thus, the Guardian Legend is my NES game that can even stand the tests of time and should be a legend on its own. I'm the Ecron Rider, and the Guardian Legend shall forever be my champion of any NES game imaginable. This stellar space adventure run by a leading lady surpasses the other common titles at warp speed. It shall always be renowned as a gamer's diamond in the rough of the competition, because even in the darkness of obscurity is where a diamond shines the brightest.